I found out the paperwork said I was dead before I ever learned whether my unborn child was going to be okay. How do you plan a future when a system you trusted quietly decides you do not exist? I was sitting at our small kitchen table in Toledo, the kind that wobbles if you lean too hard on one side. The light above us flickered the way it always did, like it was thinking about quitting. Megan had spread the papers out neatly, lined up with care, numbers circled in blue ink, a lender estimate, a list of closing costs, a printout that said pre-approval pending. She tapped the calculator with the end of her pen and smiled at me. The soft, tired smile I knew meant she was hopeful, but bracing herself. "If we skip the weekend takeout for another couple months," she said, "we can make the down payment work. It will be tight, but it is doable." I nodded and leaned back in my chair. I told her she was probably right. I told her we were close. I told her the things a man says when he wants to believe the math will eventually bend in his favor. What I did not tell her was that my chest felt tight, the way it always did when something good started to feel real. Every time I let myself imagine a future that felt solid, something from my past reached up and grabbed my ankle. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint traffic outside. We lived on the west side of town. Nothing fancy. Second floor walk-up. Brown carpet that never quite looked clean. But it was ours. We had made it ours. Megan had hung framed photos along the hallway, a camping trip near Hocking Hills, her sister's graduation, a blurry picture of us laughing on a couch that was long gone. This house we were trying to buy was different. It meant roots. It meant permanence. It meant proof that the years of overtime, the missed holidays, the quiet endurance had actually led somewhere. Megan reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You okay?" she asked. I said, "Yeah." I said I was just tired. That part was true. I had been tired for a long time. I was 41 years old, a mechanical technician at a manufacturing plant that made industrial components most people never thought about. I fixed machines that kept other machines alive. I had grease permanently stained into the lines of my hands. I worked early shifts and late shifts, and sometimes both in the same week. I paid my taxes. I stayed out of trouble. I did everything I was supposed to do. And still, there was this quiet voice in my head that said, "Do not get too comfortable." Megan stood up to pour us coffee. As she turned away, she pressed a hand to her stomach, subtle but familiar. She had started doing that more often. She thought I did not notice. I noticed everything. We had not told anyone yet. Not her parents, not my co-workers, not even our closest friends. We wanted to get through the house first. We wanted to feel stable before we said the words out loud. I watched her move around the kitchen, and a thought hit me so hard I had to look away. If this life was built on a lie, I needed to know before it swallowed her too. I cleared my throat. "There is something I should probably tell you," I said. She turned and leaned against the counter, coffee mug warming her hands. Her expression shifted, not alarmed, just attentive. "Okay," she said. "What is it?" I opened my mouth and then closed it again. The words felt heavy. I had carried them for decades without ever putting them down. I have never really talked about my family. I said, "Not the way people usually do." Megan nodded. "I know. You have said you do not talk to them anymore." That was the safe version, the simple version, the version that fit into casual conversations without making people uncomfortable. I took a breath. "I am not sure I am who my paperwork says I am." She frowned slightly, confused but patient. "What do you mean?" I looked at the stack of loan documents between us. At my name printed neatly on every page, Caleb Wright. A name I had written 1,000 times. "I mean that there is a part of my life that never made sense. I said, "And I have a bad feeling it is about to matter." Megan did not interrupt. She never did when I spoke slowly like that. I told her I would explain everything. Not tonight. Not all at once. Just that there was a past I had never opened up about. And that if we were going to build something permanent, she deserved to know where I came from. She reached for my hand again. "Whatever it is," she said, "we will handle it. We always do." I believed her. That scared me more than anything. That night, after Megan fell asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The shadows from passing cars slid across the paint in slow waves. I counted them until the numbers stopped helping. My mind drifted back to a different night, almost 23 years earlier, when I stood on a front porch with a duffel bag at my feet and no idea where I was supposed to go. I had just turned 18. It was early summer, hot enough that the air felt thick in your lungs. I remember the smell of cut grass and asphalt. I remember thinking I would be late for my shift if I did not hurry. I remember my father standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. His face was calm, almost bored. My mother stood behind him, hands clasped tight, eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder. They did not yell. They did not cry. They told me they had done their part, that I was an adult now, that it was time for me to take care of myself. I remember asking what I had done wrong. I remember my voice cracking when I asked if this was some kind of test. It was not a test. They handed me my bag and stepped back. The door closed with a soft final click that sounded louder than any slam. I had nowhere to go. No plan, no safety net. Just the understanding that whatever I thought family meant, I had misunderstood it completely. I survived that night, and the ones after it. I learned how to sleep light, how to work through pain, how to keep my head down and my mouth shut. I learned that if you do not ask too many questions, people tend to leave you alone. What I never learned was why. Lying there beside Megan, listening to her steady breathing, I realized that the question had never gone away. It had just been waiting. The next morning, I kissed her goodbye and drove to work like everything was normal. The machines did not care about my thoughts. They demanded attention, precision. In that space, I felt useful, grounded. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed in my pocket. An email notification from the bank, subject line application update. My stomach tightened. I wiped my hands and stepped into the break room to open it. The message was short, polite. It said there was an issue with my social security number that needed verification. It said the application was paused until the matter was resolved. It suggested I contact the Social Security Administration directly. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. People walked in and out of the room, laughing, complaining about schedules. The world kept moving. I told myself it was a clerical error, a typo, something simple. But the voice in my head was already awake. I drove home that evening with the windows down, letting the wind roar in my ears. Megan was waiting with dinner and questions I did not yet have answers for. I did not tell her about the email. Not yet. I wanted facts first. I wanted something solid to hold on to. As I lay in bed that night, I made a decision I had avoided for most of my life. I was going to find out where I came from, even if it meant tearing up everything I had built. Because if there was one thing I had learned the hard way, it was that buried truths never stay buried. They wait. And when they surface, they do not ask permission. I did not plan on remembering that day so clearly. But once the door closed behind me, the details never really faded. The heat hit me first. Thick, heavy, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes breathing feel like work. I stood on the porch for a second too long, my duffel bag at my feet, listening to the air conditioner hum inside the house that was no longer mine. No footsteps followed me. No one called my name. I picked up the bag and walked down the driveway, gravel crunching under my shoes. I remember thinking how quiet the neighborhood was. Lawns trimmed, cars parked neatly, life continuing as if nothing important had just happened. I had gone to work that morning like any other day. I had grease under my nails and sweat on my back. I bought myself a cheap cupcake from the gas station on the corner because it was my birthday, and that felt like something I was supposed to do. I even imagined bringing it home, cutting it in half, pretending we were a normal family for 5 minutes. Instead, I walked out with a bag and no explanation. I kept walking until the house was out of sight. Then I stopped and leaned over, hands on my knees, trying to slow my breathing. I was not crying. I did not feel dramatic. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped something essential out of my chest and forgotten to put anything back. I told myself it was temporary, that there had been some misunderstanding, that my parents would cool off and call me back. I checked my phone twice before realizing they were not going to call. Robert had been calm when he spoke. Too calm. He told me they had raised me, fed me, put a roof over my head. That I was 18 now and legally an adult. That whatever came next was my responsibility. Linda did not say much. She stood behind him, hands clenched together, eyes fixed on the floor. I remember thinking that if she would just look at me, if she would just say my name, I could handle the rest. She did not. I walked to the bus stop and sat on the bench, my bag between my feet. The cupcake was crushed inside. I threw it away without tasting it. That first night, I slept on the floor of a friend's apartment. A guy I barely knew from work. He said it was fine, no rush. But I could tell he was already calculating how long he would tolerate me. I lay there staring at the ceiling fan, listening to it click with every rotation. I left early the next morning. Pride is a strange thing. It will keep you moving even when you have nowhere to go. The weeks that followed blurred together. I worked as many hours as I could get. I slept wherever I could afford. Sometimes that meant a room with a lock, and sometimes it meant a couch or a floor. I learned how to pack my life into one bag and keep it light. People at work asked questions at first. What happened? Where were my parents? I gave them short answers. Family stuff. We do not talk anymore. The less you say, the fewer people push. At night, when the world got quiet, the questions crept in. What had I done wrong? Had I missed something? Was there some rule I had broken without realizing it? I replayed that day over and over, searching for a clue in their faces, in their words. There was nothing. Just a decision they had made long before they told me about it. By the time I found a steady place to live, a damp little room above a closed-down hardware store, something inside me had hardened. I stopped hoping for explanations. Hope hurts when it goes unanswered. I focused on survival. I learned how to fix things people did not want to fix themselves. I learned how to keep my head down and my work solid. Machines made sense. You put effort in, you got results out. No guessing. No emotional negotiations. Years passed like that. I turned 20, then 25. I built a routine. Wake up early, work, eat cheap, save what I could, repeat. I told myself this was adulthood. This was what everyone else did too. I just started a little earlier and with less support. Sometimes I would see parents with their kids at the grocery store or the park. I would feel a sharp pang, and then push it away. Dwelling on what you do not have does not pay rent. I did not talk to Robert or Linda again. Not once. No birthday cards, no calls, no accidental run-ins. It was as if I had been erased cleanly and deliberately. I told myself I was fine with that. The truth was, the silence shaped me. It taught me not to rely on anyone too heavily. It taught me to always have an exit plan. It taught me that belonging was conditional and could be revoked without warning. That mindset followed me into every part of my life. Friendships stayed shallow. Relationships ended before they could ask too much of me. I was good company, reliable, steady, but never fully present. Then one evening, after a long shift at the plant, everything shifted in a way I did not expect. I was wiping down my station when a woman walked in from the front office, looking slightly lost. She held a clipboard and wore a cardigan that looked too nice for the noise and grime of the floor. She asked if anyone could help her find the maintenance supervisor. I pointed her in the right direction. She thanked me, paused, then asked if I could also help her understand a noise coming from one of the smaller machines. She said it did not sound right. I followed her over, listened for a minute, and explained what it was. Nothing serious, just a belt that needed adjusting. She looked relieved, then embarrassed for bothering me. "You did not bother me," I said. "It is what I do." She smiled, really smiled, and introduced herself as Megan. She worked in quality control, had been there a few months. She said she still felt like she was learning where everything was. We talked for a few minutes about work, about how loud the place was, about how neither of us loved the coffee in the break room. It was nothing special, and somehow she started stopping by my area more often after that. Sometimes with a real question, sometimes just to say hi. I noticed how she listened when people spoke, how she laughed easily but not loudly, how she seemed comfortable being herself without trying to impress anyone. I did not tell her much about my life. Old habits die hard. I said I did not have much family, that I liked working with my hands, that I kept things simple. She did not push. She just stayed. Over time, that presence started to feel dangerous in a way I could not explain. Not because she was untrustworthy, but because she made me want things I had trained myself not to need. Looking back now, I realized that was the moment my carefully contained world cracked open just enough to let something real in. I did not know it then, but meeting Megan was the first step toward uncovering everything I had spent years avoiding. And once that door was open, there was no closing it again. What I did not realize at the time was how quickly something fragile can start to feel permanent when no one is trying to take it away from you. Megan and I did not rush anything. We took our time in a way that felt deliberate, almost cautious. We went on walks instead of fancy dinners. We talked about work, about books she liked, about places she wanted to see someday. I learned she had grown up moving from town to town, never staying long enough to feel settled. She learned I preferred routine and silence more than most people. When we finally moved in together, it was not a dramatic moment. It was practical. Her lease was ending. My room above the hardware store had started leaking again. We found a small apartment on the west side and split the rent. No speeches. No promises we could not keep. Living together felt natural. We both worked long hours. We cooked simple meals. We learned each other's habits without making a big deal out of them. She knew I needed quiet after work. I knew she liked to talk through her day before she could relax. A few years later, we got married at the courthouse. Just us and 2 friends as witnesses. Megan wore a simple dress she already owned. I wore the only suit I had. We went out for burgers afterward and laughed about how nothing had really changed except the paperwork. What changed was how it felt to come home. For the first time in my life, I did not brace myself when I opened the door. There was no tension in the air, no unspoken rules, just a familiar voice and a sense that I belonged where I stood. We saved what we could. Megan was careful with money. She made lists. She tracked expenses. I trusted her with that part of our life because she treated it the way I treated machines. Thoughtfully, methodically, no guessing. When she told me she was pregnant, she did it quietly, sitting across from me on the couch. She handed me the test like it was something fragile. I remember staring at it for a long time, trying to understand how a few lines could carry so much weight. Fear and joy tangled together in my chest. We hugged and cried and then immediately started talking about practical things. Doctor visits, insurance, savings. We agreed not to tell anyone yet. We wanted to get our footing first. That was when the idea of buying a house stopped feeling like a distant dream and started feeling like a necessity. We found a modest place outside Columbus. 2 bedrooms, a small yard, nothing flashy. It was close enough to work and far enough from the noise. Megan loved the light in the kitchen. I loved the garage. We sat at our kitchen table night after night going over numbers, running scenarios, cutting back where we could. We were not reckless. We were careful. The day we went to the bank, Megan wore a light blue dress and held my hand tighter than usual. I told her everything would be fine. I believed it. The banker smiled and congratulated us. She took our paperwork and typed for a long time. Too long. Her smile faded slightly. She apologized and said there was a small issue that needed verification. She said my social security number had been flagged and the application would need to be paused. Paused is a gentle word. It sounds temporary, manageable. We left the bank in silence. Megan squeezed my hand in the parking lot and told me it was probably nothing. A system error. A typo. I nodded and told her I would take care of it. That evening, while we were making dinner, my phone buzzed. An email from North River Components, Human Resources. They informed me that due to an active verification process involving my personal identification, I was being placed on temporary paid suspension effective immediately. 90 days. Pending review. My chest tightened. I read the email twice to make sure I had not misunderstood it. Megan noticed my face change. "What is it?" she asked. I told her it was a work issue. I said it was nothing serious, that it would sort itself out. The words tasted false even as I said them. Before I could say anything else, Megan's phone rang. She answered and listened quietly, nodding. When she hung up, she told me the clinic needed to confirm her next appointment and asked about payment details. I felt like the floor had shifted under my feet. 2 things I depended on had suddenly become uncertain. My job, my identity. And tied to both of them was the future of the woman sitting across from me and the child she was carrying. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the banker's expression, the careful language in the email, the timing. The next morning, I called the Social Security Administration and scheduled an appointment. The earliest they could see me was 2 days later. I did not tell Megan everything. Not yet. I did not want to scare her without answers. When I walked into the SSA office, the building felt cold and impersonal. Plastic chairs, fluorescent lights, people waiting with folders clutched to their chests. I explained the issue to the clerk at the counter. She typed my number into her computer and frowned. She typed again. Then she asked me to take a seat. A few minutes later, a man in a plain suit called my name and led me into a small office. He closed the door and looked at his screen for a long time. He told me there was a discrepancy in my records that required further review. He said my number was associated with a case that had been marked deceased decades ago. I laughed at first, not because it was funny, but because it sounded absurd. He did not laugh. He told me the case had been escalated to a federal level because of a linked financial trust and potential identity fraud. He said investigators would be contacting me. I left the office feeling numb. The parking lot looked the same. Cars moved in and out. People went about their day. But something fundamental had shifted. On the drive home, I thought about the question Megan had asked me at the table weeks earlier. Who are you? Really? I had never had a clear answer that night. I told her the truth. Not all of it. Just enough that my records were being reviewed, that my job was on hold, that it might take time. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she reached for my hand and told me we would figure it out together. I wanted to believe that was enough. As I lay awake beside her, staring into the dark, I realized that whatever was coming next was not just about paperwork. It was about uncovering a past that had been carefully buried, and I was no longer in control of how deep the digging would go. The digging started without asking whether I was ready for it. 2 days after the SSA appointment, my phone rang while I was standing in the grocery store aisle, staring at a shelf of generic cereal and doing math in my head. The caller ID showed a blocked number. I almost ignored it. Something told me not to. The woman on the other end spoke calmly, professionally. She said her name was Laura Chen and that she worked with a federal investigative unit connected to identity verification cases. She asked if I was Caleb Wright and if I had time to answer a few questions. I told her yes and pushed my card aside, leaning against the cold metal shelving. My heart was already beating too fast. She said my file had been escalated due to irregularities tied to my Social Security number and a dormant financial trust that had been reactivated by the bank inquiry. She said this did not mean I was in trouble, but it did mean they needed to verify who I was and how I came to be using that number. I asked her to explain what that meant. She said it meant I should expect to meet with an investigator soon and that my accounts would remain temporarily restricted until the process was complete. Temporarily is another gentle word. It still feels like falling when you hear it. That evening, I logged into my bank account out of habit. The balance was there, but every function was locked. No transfers, no withdrawals, just a notice telling me to contact customer support. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the screen until Megan came in and noticed I had not moved. She did not raise her voice. She did not panic. She sat across from me and asked what else I had not told her. So I told her. About the call. About the frozen account. About the word federal. Her face went pale, but she kept her voice steady. She asked if this meant I had done something wrong. I told her no. Or at least, I told her I did not think so. That I believed I was the one being looked into, not the one accused. She nodded slowly and placed a hand over her stomach. "We will handle it," she said. "One step at a time." The next day, a man named Daniel Brooks came to our apartment. He wore plain clothes and carried himself like someone who had learned how to disappear into rooms when necessary. He showed his badge briefly and asked if we could talk somewhere private. We sat at the same kitchen table where we had planned our future a week earlier. He explained the situation in careful terms. My Social Security number had originally been issued to a child born in the mid-1980s. That child had been declared deceased before their second birthday. The number should never have resurfaced. Yet it had. It had followed me through school records, job applications, tax filings. It had functioned without issue for decades, until it did not. Brooks told me there was a trust associated with the original identity, a financial instrument created by the biological family of the deceased child. It had been untouched for years, until my loan application triggered a system review. The amount was just under $2 million. Not a fortune by some standards, but large enough to draw attention. I felt dizzy. None of this made sense. I had grown up poor. I had worked for everything I had. I had never inherited anything. Brooks asked me questions about my childhood, where I was born, who my parents were, whether I remembered hospitals or doctors or moves between states. I answered honestly. I told him what I knew, which was not much. I told him about Robert and Linda, about being kicked out at 18, about never seeing any paperwork other than a birth certificate I had once glanced at and never questioned. He listened without interrupting. Chen took notes. When they left, Brooks told me they would be conducting a full review. birth records, school enrollment, medical data, anything that could help establish a timeline. I asked him how long it would take. He said weeks, maybe months, after they left. Megan sat quietly for a long time. Then she stood up and started washing dishes we had not used. I knew that was how she processed stress. That night, I could not stop thinking about the questions Brooks had asked. The ones I had brushed off for years. Why had we moved so often when I was young? Why had there been no grandparents, no aunts or uncles? Why had I never been allowed to play at other kids' houses? Why had Robert always insisted on handling paperwork himself? Memories started lining up in my head like puzzle pieces I had ignored. A scar on my lower back that no one could explain. A hospital visit when I was very young that Linda refused to talk about. The way they never celebrated my birthday with photos or kept baby pictures around. At the time, I had assumed they were private people. Now, the silence felt deliberate. A few days later, Brooks called again. He asked if I would come down to the field office for fingerprinting and photographs. The building was nondescript, tucked between other offices downtown. Inside, everything was clean and efficient. No drama, no raised voices, no raised. They took my fingerprints and scanned them into multiple systems. Brooks watched the screen as the data processed. His expression changed slightly. He asked if I had ever been reported missing. I said not that I knew of. He told me there was a match in a national database. A missing child report from Arizona, filed in the mid-1980s. The age and physical markers aligned closely with mine. I felt something crack open in my chest. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. Brooks explained that the case had gone cold years ago. The family had eventually stopped searching after every lead dried up. They had never stopped hoping. I drove home in silence. The road felt unreal, like I was watching it through glass. When I walked through the door, Megan looked at me and knew something had changed. "They think I might have been taken," I said. She covered her mouth with her hand and started to cry. Not loud, just quiet tears that shook her shoulders. I held her and felt the weight of what that possibility meant. Not just for me, but for the life we were trying to build. That night, I dreamed of doors closing, over and over. Different houses, different faces, always the same final sound. The next morning, Brooks called again. He asked me if I had any photos of Robert and Linda, any recent addresses, any information at all. He said they needed to talk to them. As I stared at my phone, I realized something I had not allowed myself to consider before. The people who raised me were not just distant or cold. They might have been hiding me, and if that was true, then everything I thought I knew about my beginning was about to be torn apart. I told Brooks what I could. Old addresses, a place in Indiana they had lived briefly, an auto shop Robert worked at years ago. He thanked me and said they would take it from there. When I hung up, I sat down heavily on the couch. Megan sat beside me and rested her head on my shoulder. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "we face it together." I nodded, but my mind was already racing ahead. Because if I had been taken, then someone out there had lost a child, and I had been living that child's life without ever knowing it. As the investigation moved forward, I understood that there was no version of this story that ended quietly. The truth was already in motion, and it was not going to stop until it reached the surface. Once the idea took hold, it refused to stay abstract. I went through my days in a fog, answering calls from investigators, signing consent forms, digging through boxes I had not opened in years. Every memory felt suspect now. Things I had dismissed as quirks or bad luck suddenly carried weight. Brooks and Chen asked me to come back to the field office a week later. This time, the meeting room felt smaller. The air was heavy, like everyone already knew what was coming. They laid out the timeline slowly, carefully, as if speaking too fast might break something fragile. A child had gone missing in Arizona in 1985. A boy, just over a year old, taken from a public place in a moment of distraction. The parents reported it immediately. Police searched, volunteers searched. The case made local news for a while, then faded as most of them do. What did not fade was the file. Chen turned a monitor toward me. On the screen was a scanned report. Grainy photos, a description of identifying marks. One line caught my eye and would not let go. Distinctive scar on lower back, origin unknown. My breath caught. I had that scar. I had always had it. Robert once told me I fell off a swing as a baby. Linda never liked talking about it. Brooks watched my face closely. He asked if I would consent to a more thorough medical comparison. I nodded without hesitation. The tests were invasive in a quiet way. Measurements. Old hospital records pulled from places I had never lived. According to everything I thought I knew. Each confirmation felt like a small crack in the foundation of my life. The final piece was DNA. They took samples from me and told me they would compare them against what little biological material remained in the missing child file and against any living relatives who could be located. The waiting was the worst part. Megan tried to keep our days normal. She made meals. She reminded me to eat. She talked about small things. Her students, a show she wanted to watch. I listened and nodded and held her hand. But my mind was somewhere else. At night, I lay awake replaying scenes from my childhood with new eyes. The constant moving. Indiana, then Ohio, then a short stretch in Kentucky before settling again. The way Robert always insisted on handling school enrollment himself. The way Linda froze whenever someone asked where I was born. I remembered men coming by the house late at night sometimes. Not often, but enough that I noticed. They would talk in low voices in the garage. I was never allowed near them. I remembered being told not to talk to strangers, not to answer questions, not to mention family details at school. At the time, it felt strict. Now it felt calculated. When Brooks called again, his voice was different. Not urgent, but serious in a way that made my stomach drop. He said the DNA results were back. I drove to the office alone that time. Megan wanted to come, but I asked her to stay home. I did not know what I would be walking into. And I did not want her sitting across from strangers watching my life unravel in real time. Brooks and Chen did not waste words. The DNA matched, not partially, not coincidentally. It was a direct biological match to the family of the missing child. I was not using someone else's number by accident. I was the child who had been reported missing. The room went quiet. I stared at the table, tracing the wood grain with my eyes as if it might anchor me. Brooks explained what that meant in legal terms. I had been abducted. My identity had been replaced. The Social Security number I had used belonged to a child who had died. Not me. Someone had made a deliberate choice to hide me inside a dead identity. He did not say who yet. He did not need to. The pieces had already fallen into place. Robert and Linda had lost a child. That part was easy to verify. A son born a year before the abduction. He had died in an accident. Official records confirmed it. Shortly after that, they had disappeared from the area where the missing child was taken. Within months, they resurfaced in another state with a toddler who suddenly had a name and paperwork that did not belong to him. Me. I felt sick. Brooks asked if I needed a moment. I shook my head. If I stopped now, I was not sure I would be able to start again. He asked me about my upbringing, about discipline, about affection, about fear. I told him the truth. That I had been fed and clothed and housed, that I had never been hit, that I had never felt truly safe either. I told him how Robert controlled everything. Money, movement, information. I told him how Linda oscillated between distant kindness and silent panic. Brooks listened. He nodded occasionally, as if he had heard versions of this story before. He said it was common for abductors to justify their actions, to convince themselves they were saving a child, filling a void, fixing a wrong done to them by the world. I thought about my 18th birthday, the suitcase, the door closing, the absence of emotion. They had not thrown me out because they were done raising me. They had thrown me out because I was no longer useful. Once I was old enough to ask questions, to demand documents, to move freely, I became a liability. The thought made my hands shake. Brooks asked if I was willing to help with the investigation, to provide addresses, photos, anything that might lead them to Robert and Linda. I said yes without hesitation. I dug through old email accounts, social media profiles I barely used, boxes of photographs I had not looked at since moving in with Megan. There were not many pictures of my childhood. Another thing I had never questioned. I found one photo of Robert and Linda taken at a picnic years ago. Their faces relaxed, almost happy. It made my stomach twist. I gave Brooks everything I had. When I got home, Megan was waiting. She knew before I spoke. She read it in my face. They found my real family, I said. She sat down slowly and took my hands. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. I told her everything. About the abduction, about Robert and Linda, about the dead child whose name I had carried. She cried quietly, then pulled me into her arms. I felt her hands trembling against my back. "None of this is your fault," she said. I wanted to believe that. Guilt has a way of sticking even when logic says it should not. That night, after Megan fell asleep, I sat alone in the dark and thought about the people who had lost a child all those years ago. They had lived with that absence every day, while I had lived in a house that was never truly mine. Brooks called the next morning. He said they had located the biological parents. They were alive, living in Arizona. He asked if I wanted to meet them. The question landed heavier than anything else had so far. I had spent my life assuming I had been unwanted, disposable. The idea that someone out there had been searching for me for decades felt unreal. I did not answer right away, because once I said yes, there would be no going back. And I knew that whatever waited on the other side of that meeting would change me in ways I could not yet imagine. Saying yes felt like stepping onto a bridge I could not see the end of. The meeting was set for the following week in Scottsdale, Arizona. Brooks explained that my biological parents had agreed to speak with me under controlled conditions. No press, no public record yet. Just a quiet room and a truth that had waited decades. The flight west felt unreal. Megan sat beside me, holding my hand during turbulence, her thumb tracing small circles against my skin. Neither of us talked much. Words felt inadequate for what was coming. When we landed, the air was dry and warm. Different from Ohio, everything looked brighter, sharper. We drove to a low-profile office building tucked away from the main roads. No signs, just a security desk and a waiting area with neutral art on the walls. Brooks met us there. He looked more formal than usual, jacket pressed, posture straight. He asked if I was ready. I said I did not know what ready meant anymore. They brought me into a conference room. Megan waited outside at my request. I needed to face this alone first. Jonathan Pierce and Elaine Pierce were already seated at the table. They stood when I entered, both of them moving at the same time and then stopping, unsure what to do next. Jonathan was tall, silver hair neatly combed, hands clasped in front of him like he was holding himself together by force. Elaine looked smaller than I expected, elegant in a restrained way. Her eyes fixed on my face as if afraid to blink. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence pressed down on my ears. Elaine was the first to move. She took a step toward me, then hesitated, her hand half raised, unsure whether she was allowed to touch me. She whispered my name. Hearing it from her mouth felt different, heavier, real in a way it had never felt before. Jonathan cleared his throat and gestured toward a chair. "Please," he said quietly. "Sit." I sat. My legs felt unsteady, like they belonged to someone else. Brooks and Chen stood off to the side, giving us space without leaving. They explained the DNA confirmation in clear terms. 99.9% certainty? No doubt. Elaine covered her mouth and started crying. Not loudly, just a soft, broken sound that seemed to come from deep inside her chest. Jonathan sat down heavily, his shoulders slumping. He stared at the table for a moment, then looked up at me with eyes that were red and wet. "We never stopped looking for you," he said. Not a day went by. I did not know what to say. The words stuck somewhere between my throat and my heart. Elaine reached out and placed her hand on mine. Her fingers trembled. "I am so sorry," she said. "We should have protected you. I should have held you tighter." The guilt in her voice hit me harder than any accusation could have. They told me about the day I disappeared. A park. A moment of distraction. Panic. Police. Flyers. Years of searching that turned into years of waiting for a miracle that never came. Jonathan talked about throwing himself into work to survive the grief. About building a company that grew larger than he ever intended, because stopping meant feeling the loss again. Elaine talked about therapy, about sleepless nights, about birthdays marked by silence. I listened, my chest aching with a strange mix of sorrow and something close to anger. Not at them. At the time stolen from all of us. After a while, Brooks suggested a break. Elaine wiped her eyes and nodded. Jonathan stood and walked to the window, his back to us, breathing slowly. When we resumed Bemsurth, the conversation shifted. Jonathan explained that their lives now were complicated. They were not public figures exactly, but they were known. Their company, Pierce Holdings, operated in multiple states. There were legal considerations, media risks. They had lived quietly for a reason. I understood what he was saying even before he said it outright. Finding me again was not just emotional. It was disruptive. Elaine squeezed my hand again. "That does not mean we do not want you," she said quickly. "It just means we have to be careful." I nodded. Careful was a word I knew well. Before we finished, another man entered the room. Younger, mid-30s. He stopped short when he saw me, his eyes scanning my face with open confusion. Jonathan turned. "This is Marcus," he said. "Your brother." Marcus looked between Jonathan and Elaine, then back at me. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. "So this is him," he said flatly. Jonathan told him to sit. Marcus did, but his posture was rigid, defensive. No one had warned him. Elaine said softly, "We did not know how." Marcus studied me for a long moment. I could see the calculation behind his eyes. Measuring, comparing. He asked where I had been all these years. His tone was controlled, but there was an edge to it. I told him the short version: Ohio, factory work, married, expecting a child. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. After a few more minutes of strained conversation, Brooks ended the meeting. He said there would be time for everything later. This was just the beginning. As we stood to leave, Elaine hugged me. This time, she did not hesitate. She held on like she was afraid I might disappear again. Jonathan placed a hand on my shoulder. "We will do this the right way," he said. "Together." Marcus said nothing. Outside, Megan was waiting. Elaine embraced her too, tears starting again as she spoke about grandchildren and lost time. Megan was gracious, overwhelmed, kind. On the drive back to the hotel, Megan finally spoke. "How do you feel?" she asked. I searched for an answer and found none that fit. Like I walked into someone else's life. I said, like I am standing in the wrong place and the right one at the same time. That night, I lay awake thinking about Marcus, about the way he had looked at me. not with curiosity, with suspicion. I understood it. I was a stranger who had walked into a carefully balanced world. A few days later, Jonathan called. He said there was an opportunity for me at Pierce Holdings, an entry-level role, nothing flashy, a chance to learn and earn my place. I told him I would think about it. The truth was, I already knew the answer. If I was going to claim my past, I had to step into the present that came with it. But I also knew that stepping into that world meant stepping into conflict I did not yet understand. Because families do not just heal because the truth comes out. Sometimes the truth is what exposes the fractures that were already there. Accepting the job meant stepping into a world that already had an opinion about me before I ever walked through the door. Pierce Holdings headquarters sat on the edge of Scottsdale. All glass and clean lines. The kind of place designed to signal stability and control. I arrived early on my first day, wearing a suit Megan had helped me pick out, one that felt stiff and unfamiliar on my shoulders. I reminded myself I had earned my way here, even if the path had been twisted. Human Resources handled my paperwork quickly. No fanfare, no special treatment. I was assigned to the logistics division, entry level, reporting through a department manager who seemed polite but cautious. Everyone knew who I was, even if no one said it out loud. Marcus did not come to greet me. At first, that was a relief. The work itself was demanding, but familiar in a different way. Supply chains, inventory timing, vendor coordination. It was all systems and processes, just more abstract than the machines I was used to. I stayed late, asked questions, took notes. I did not expect help, and I did not ask for favors. Marcus began inserting himself slowly. He would stop by meetings unannounced, ask pointed questions about numbers I had just received, assign tasks that came with incomplete data, then follow up as if delays were my fault. Nothing overt, nothing you could easily call out without sounding defensive. The pressure built quietly. At the same time, the investigation into Robert and Linda moved forward. Brooks kept me updated when he could. They had been located in Indiana, living quietly under their original names. Interviews were scheduled, assets were reviewed. The trust linked to the dead child remained frozen, while attorneys argued over jurisdiction and intent. Karma does not rush, it observes. Megan joined me in Arizona a few weeks later. Her doctor cleared the travel, and I could not bear being apart anymore. We rented a modest apartment close to work. She nested immediately, arranging furniture, cooking meals that made the place feel like home. She listened when I talked about the job, about Marcus, about the tension I felt walking into meetings. She never told me to quit. She just reminded me why I was there. "You are not taking anything from anyone," she said one night as we folded laundry. "You are just standing where you belong." I wanted to believe that. The first real clash came during a quarterly review. I had been working on a long-stalled vendor contract that everyone else had written off. I spent nights combing through old emails, tracing where communication had broken down. I found an error in a data transfer that predated my involvement by years. I fixed it, quietly. The vendor responded within hours. When I presented the update, Marcus interrupted before I could finish. He questioned my assumptions, suggested I had overstepped my role. I stayed calm. I walked through the timeline, the documentation, the corrected figures. The room went quiet. Jonathan, seated at the head of the table, asked Marcus to let me finish. His tone was even, but the shift in authority was unmistakable. After the meeting, Marcus cornered me in the hallway. His smile did not reach his eyes. "You are moving fast," he said. "Might want to be careful. This place does not always reward initiative." I told him I was just doing my job. He laughed softly and walked away. That was when I started saving everything. Emails, meeting notes, version histories. Not because I wanted to accuse him of anything, but because experience had taught me that truth without proof rarely survives. Brooks called one evening as Megan and I were eating dinner. His voice was steady. "Robert and Linda have been formally charged," he said. "Kidnapping, identity fraud, conspiracy." I closed my eyes and let the weight of it settle. No relief, no triumph, just a sense of finality. He told me the legal process would take time, that the trust funds would remain under court supervision until everything was resolved, that my legal identity restoration was moving forward. But slowly. Nothing about this was simple. A week later, Brooks called again. This time, his tone was different. "We found irregularities at Pierce Holdings," he said. "Financial discrepancies tied to internal oversight. Marcus is connected." My chest tightened. Brooks explained that during the review of trust movements and corporate disclosures, patterns had emerged. Marcus had been rerouting resources, masking losses, shifting responsibility downward. It was subtle, strategic, until it was not. "We are not acting yet," Brooks said. "We are watching." I did not tell Jonathan or Elaine. I did not confront Marcus. I did nothing at all. Instead, I kept working. The pressure intensified. Marcus assigned me to a compliance audit with impossible deadlines. He questioned my decisions publicly. He implied mistakes that did not exist. Each time, I responded with data. Each time, his frustration showed a little more. Megan noticed the strain. She held my hand at night and reminded me to breathe. She talked to our son before he was born, telling him stories about resilience and patience. One afternoon, Brooks asked me to come in quietly. He showed me what they had found. The paper trail. The emails Marcus thought were buried. The internal approvals that pointed to deliberate misrepresentation. "You do not need to do anything," Brooks said. "Just keep being exactly who you are." The irony was not lost on me. A few days later, Marcus was called into an executive meeting he did not come back from. The announcement was brief. An internal review was underway. Certain responsibilities were being reassigned, pending further investigation. Marcus did not look at me when he passed my desk carrying a box. That evening, Jonathan called. He sounded tired, older. "I should have seen it," he said. "I was so focused on finding you that I missed what was happening right in front of me." I told him everyone misses something eventually. Meanwhile, my own legal process reached a critical point. Brooks said the court was ready to formally recognize my identity as distinct from the deceased child. The trust would be transferred under strict oversight once final approvals were signed. It was happening. Slowly, methodically. The night before the hearing, I sat on the balcony of our apartment, the desert air cool against my skin. Megan joined me, resting a hand on her belly. "Tomorrow changes things," she said. I nodded. Not just on paper, because once the law acknowledged who I really was, there would be no place left for the past to hide. And I knew the final chapter of this story was about to begin. The morning of the hearing arrived quietly, like it did not understand how much it carried. Megan and I drove downtown before sunrise, the city still half asleep. She rested her hand on her belly the entire way, a habit that had become second nature for both of us. I kept my eyes on the road, steady, focused, reminding myself that this was not a moment to rush through. The courthouse was all stone and glass, heavy with history and procedure. Brooks met us at the entrance and guided us through security with calm efficiency. He did not say much. He did not need to. Everything that could be done had already been done. Inside the courtroom, the air felt dense. Lawyers shuffled papers. Clerks moved with practiced indifference. People who had nothing to do with my life, prepared to decide what it officially meant. The judge entered and the room stood. I felt Megan squeeze my hand. The hearing itself was not dramatic. No raised voices, no grand speeches, just records, timelines. Testimony laid out piece by piece. Birth certificates, DNA confirmations, statements about the misuse of an identity belonging to a deceased child, statements about the child who had lived under that name for decades. Me, when it was my turn to speak. I stood and told the truth. Not emotionally, not defensively, just clearly. Where I had lived, how I had been raised, what I had learned only recently, how the discovery had impacted my family and my work. I did not mention anger. I did not mention revenge. I did not need to. The judge listened and asked a few questions. Then he nodded slowly and announced the ruling. My legal identity was formally restored, my name, my date of birth, my existence. The Social Security number tied to the deceased child was retired permanently. A new one issued under my rightful identity. The trust linked to the original case would be transferred under court supervision, released in stages once all criminal proceedings concluded. It was done, not instantly, not cleanly, but done. As we left the courtroom, I felt lighter in a way I had never experienced before, like something heavy had finally been set down. Outside, Megan hugged me tightly, careful but firm. She laughed through tears and pressed her forehead against my chest. "You are here," she said. "You are really here?" I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The weeks that followed were full of adjustments. New documents, updated records, long conversations with lawyers and accountants. Nothing glamorous. Just the slow work of making a life official. Robert and Linda pleaded guilty. The sentencing came later. I did not attend. I did not need to see them again to understand what they had done. I felt no satisfaction when the news came, only closure. At Pierce Holdings, the internal investigation concluded quietly. Marcus resigned under advisement of counsel. Jonathan addressed the company in a brief statement about accountability and transparency. Marcus and I spoke once after that. Not to argue, not to reconcile completely, just to acknowledge what had happened. He admitted fear. Fear of being replaced. Fear of losing what he believed was his. He did not ask for forgiveness. I did not offer it. We shook hands and went our separate ways. Jonathan and Elaine tried to make up for lost time in their own way. Calls, invitations, careful gestures that respected the distance I still needed. They did not push. They let me lead. I appreciated that more than they knew. Megan and I bought the house we had first looked at months earlier. It was still there, still modest, still perfect for us. We closed quietly and moved in with borrowed trucks and the help of a few friends. On the first night, we sat on the living room floor with takeout boxes and laughed about how empty the place felt. I opened the back door and stood in the small yard, breathing in the cool evening air. "This is home," Megan said. I believed her. Our son was born that fall. Healthy, loud, perfect. I held him in my arms and felt something settle into place that I had not realized was missing. I gave him my name, not the one stolen, not the one borrowed, mine, as life found its rhythm again. I thought often about how close everything had come to unraveling, how easily I could have chosen bitterness or silence, how tempting it would have been to walk away from the truth and protect what I had built. But the truth has a way of demanding attention. Ignoring it only gives it more power. I learned that revenge does not always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like survival, like standing up quietly and refusing to let a lie define you any longer. I learned that family is not just blood or history. It is who stays when the ground shifts beneath your feet. And I learned that identity is not something handed to you by paperwork or circumstance. It is something you claim by living honestly, even when honesty costs you comfort. If you have made it this far, I want to know something. If you discovered that the foundation of your life was built on a lie, would you dig for the truth, knowing it might change everything? Or would you let it stay buried to keep the peace you already have? Let me know what you think. And if this story meant something to you, Stay here with me. There are more truths worth telling, and more stories where karma takes its time, but never misses.